Endurance in Last Epoch is another one of those systems that can seem a little bit complicated, but it's actually surprisingly simple once you understand how it works. We're going to go over that core mechanic, compare it to some of the other defensive attributes and how you might want to weigh it when comparing and trying to decide which affixes to use. And then we'll talk about some builds where you might want to focus on endurance a little bit more than just strictly health. Let's jump in. So I've been putting together a low life lich. That's one of the builds that can maybe benefit a little bit from this endurance we're going to be talking about here, but let's just jump into the core mechanic, how it works. So if we look at the in-game guide, it tells us that while your health is less than your endurance threshold, you will take less damage equal to your endurance value. The reduction applies to health, but does not apply to ward. There's a 60% cap on endurance. It gives us an example. Then it explains that all characters start with 20% endurance and have an endurance threshold equal to 20% of their maximum health. It's kind of hard to explain. The numbers seem a little bit weird. But if we just look at our character sheet, we can kind of get an idea of how this stat works. So endurance is a percentage, endurance threshold is a number. If we mouse over our health bar, the yellow line, where that yellow line is, that's the threshold. And endurance as a percentage, the endurance percentage isn't really represented visually anywhere, but you just know that when you're below that threshold, when your health is below this yellow bar, you will only take damage equal to 1 minus this percentage. So in this case, we take 80% of the damage we normally take because our endurance is 20%. It kind of makes sense that endurance would have a cap, because if it didn't have a cap, it'd be, like they'd have to implement some kind of system to prevent you from stacking it to 100%, because if it were 100%, then you'd hit that endurance threshold and you would never die because you have 100% damage reduction. So they limit it to 60, so once you hit that, you'll always be taking at least 40% of the damage you would be taking. Simple enough. For the most part, affixes that impact this are going to impact endurance as a percentage and endurance threshold as a number, exactly how you'd expect. Another thing to keep in mind is that endurance stacks on top of all other systems. So like when we talked about resistances in the last video, that also will apply to endurance. Like your resistances also apply in endurance, your dodge, your armor, all that stuff still applies. This is just an additional reduction as a flat percentage that will reduce damage taken. And I think that's kind of it. There's not much more to it, but we can kind of equip some gear and go through some examples. So like this ring, for example, has 23 endurance threshold. So if we equip this, simple enough, our endurance threshold goes up to 101 from 78 where it was before, and we'll have more effective health because our endurance threshold is going up. So if we do this and then mouse over, you can see that the yellow bar has moved up just a little bit. As another example, let's equip this shield that gives us plus 7% endurance. As I said before, this isn't really represented visually anywhere, but our health below our endurance threshold in this bottom part will now be a little bit better because our endurance is 27%, so we'll only take, 73% of the damage we would normally be taking because we have a little bit more endurance. That's how you stack just core endurance. Something else interesting to note here, as we mentioned earlier, is that all characters start with 20% endurance and have endurance threshold equal to 20% of their maximum health. Right, so it's a little funky. How does that impact us? Essentially, what that means is as your health goes up, because endurance at its base is calculated as a percentage, if we increase our health, the amount of health we have within that endurance is also going to go up. So let's equip these gloves here that give us plus 17 health. Again, you can look, our current endurance threshold is 78. If we increase our maximum health, our endurance threshold is also going to go up to, 20% of that baseline that we've got here. So now it's at 81, so a little bit more. So if you're trying to do a low life build, increasing maximum life also helps, again, intuitively. But how do we balance these things? How do we compare what affixes we should be using? I've put a spreadsheet together, as I do. Let's flip over and check it out. Okay, so there's a few columns here. Don't get intimidated. It's less gnarly than it looks, I promise. So we'll just hold our health constant here. We'll say we've got 1,000 health, which is, maybe mid-late game. You'd probably be around in that range depending on your class, but it gives us something that we can use as a baseline to compare. Again, our base endurance as a base is 20%, and the threshold is 20%. Again, threshold's a number, don't forget, so it's 81 in our example here, but it's 20%. It starts at 20% of your health. So if you have 1,000 health, 20% of that is going to be 200 health, and that is your base starting threshold. And then your endurance, again, is 20%, so you have a 20% damage reduction when you're below it. These other columns here, E and G, will give us additional endurance and additional threshold. Again, endurance is the percentage, and remember that this is capped at 60%, and additional threshold is just increasing the, starting point. If you want, your threshold can be all the way up. It can be equivalent to your health. The reason that we care about these things in particular is because there are suffixes which can modify these values. So we'll use this as a baseline. We'll say a tier 5 endurance suffix gives us 15% endurance. Again, that's the endurance, the damage reduction number. A endurance threshold affix, also a suffix, tier 5, the upper roll would be a 75, so we'll use that to compare. We can compare this 15% endurance versus 75 endurance threshold. And let's play with those numbers and see where we wind up. So as a baseline, again, we have 2020, let's say we had no affixes. If we had 1,000 health, our endurance is 20%, as I said, our threshold's 200, we end up with 1,050 effective HP. You can look at the math here and see how that's calculated. There'll be a link to the spreadsheet in the video description if you want to make a copy for yourself and play with this. But then what we'll do is we'll play with the numbers and we'll say, okay, well, let's say we had 6 additional endurance affixes, like 1 in every slot we could put it on, and 0 additional threshold affixes. And then as we go down here, we'll flip. So we'll have 5 and 1, and then 4 and 2, etc., until we get all the way to 6 additional threshold affixes and 0 additional endurance affixes. So we can take this and then kind of figure out where an optimal spot would be just looking at these two affixes if we were comparing them. Note that, again, endurance is capped to 60%. So if we start with all endurance threshold, we have 100% going to endurance threshold. A bunch of that gets wasted because we're like missing out. 40% of it's lost. We're only getting 60%. So we end up with 1,300 effective HP. And then as we tick that down, kind of naturally as you'd expect, right? Like we're getting more threshold and we're not losing a stat that is actually doing anything meaningful. So until we get to here, it's like increasing as we do less additional endurance because we're at 60% up until that point. But then once we get to this row, now we're below our 60%. Well, we're below 45% additional, which puts us at 65% total, which means we have 60% endurance. If we do another one of those, we'll end up with 50% endurance. So we're going down a little bit. But as you can see, as soon as we hit that point, it becomes less effective to have points in additional threshold. What this means is that even if you could put all of your points in additional threshold, for the most part, again, if we're comparing like the equivalent tiered affix, additional endurance is generally going to give you more effective HP per affix than additional threshold. So that's kind of something good to keep in mind. Unless there's a reason you want your threshold really high, and I haven't really seen any builds that do want that, usually endurance as a percentage, like increasing that damage reduction and getting it up to 60% is going to give you more bang for your buck. As we noted earlier though, there's one other little twist here. So I've got some columns hidden. We're going to unhide them. Additional health and effective health. Oh, and we're going to move the window over so you guys can see. Okay, so I've got some more examples here. Now we're going to compare additional health as an affix as well. So we have this additional health affix that can give us 12% as a max roll for tier 5. What we're going to do is use our best example we had here with this 1638 with a spread of, what is this? 3 additional endurances and 3 additional thresholds, and we'll kind of use that as a starting point. We'll start by effectively replacing one of those additional thresholds. So this is actually only 2 additional thresholds, and then we're putting one of those into an additional health. So we're 1 additional health, 3 additional endurance, and 2 additional threshold. What that does is nets us an effective HP of 1681. If we compare that, it's a little bit better than our 1638. So it's like, okay, maybe it's worth our time to just increase our health instead. Should we keep doing that? Let's notch it down again. We go up to 1725. This is down to 1 additional threshold. Then if we go all the way to the baseline threshold and put another 1 additional health, 1768. It keeps going up. It goes up further. 1776 as we put another one in. It does flip over briefly on the next row. So we do get 1772. So the numbers are pretty close here. But then once we go fully commit, we go all 6 of them into additional health, we wind up with this 1806 effective HP. And it's like, well, this is the best number we've seen. This seems like a weird conclusion to draw in a video about endurance. It seems like you should always just ignore endurance and increase your health, and for a lot of builds, I mean, that is kind of the wisdom that you'll find if you go look online. But there are some interesting cases here, in that there are a number of builds in-game which will do things when you are at low life. So we'll use Lich again as an example. So if we look at some abilities, we'll look at like Dance with Death. It's increased damage by 30% as a baseline, and this doesn't scale, but as soon as you have a point in this effect is tripled, so we would get 90% increased damage when we are below 35% health. It's like, okay, well, how does that play into this math? Well, because we want to be below 35% health, what endurance is effectively doing is increasing the density of our health bar, like the amount of HP that is sitting in the bottom of our health bar. So what we can do is we can be below 35% health technically, but we still end up having a lot of HP because what we've done is concentrated our effective hit points at the bottom portion of our health that's in endurance. So if we flip back to the spreadsheet, this still holds true. You would still have more effective health as this low life Lich in this case, but what you may actually want is, you know, to like balance this somewhere down in here a little bit more, where you end up slanting more of your health down into that bottom portion, but your endurance has a lot more resiliency baked into it, so you'll stay alive a lot longer and it'll be easier to sit down below whatever those checks are. There are a number of builds that have something that can kind of trigger on this. Lich is the big one, but there's some other effects for other classes. It'll just depend on the build, but if you look around for low life builds on Last Epoch, you'll find them. But that's kind of the major takeaway, is if you're not running something that cares about being at low life, you effectively should, for the most part, just should be scaling your health. But if you're running another build and you're just trying to be more tanky and you've kind of maxed out the number of other suffixes that you're looking for, you can always throw endurance into the mix. It's not a bad stat, but I would say look at endurance for the most part before you look at endurance threshold, because that endurance multiplier is just going to be more potent. But yeah, that's endurance. Hopefully now you understand a little bit better. If you have any questions, feel free to leave a comment or catch me live on Twitch or hop in the Discord. I'm always talking to the community there. There'll be links to both of those in the description. If you have anything you'd like to see a video on, I'd love to hear that as well. We've been kind of doing these more pseudo deep dives into a series of Last Epoch topics, so I'm kind of going through all these mechanics and breaking them down a little bit. If you want to stay tuned for those, be sure to subscribe. I think that's it. Thank you for watching. Have a good one.